If you thought the last video was exciting about the discovery of the ossuaries of Mary, Martha, Lazarus, and Simeon the priest and his daughter, and others that were buried in the tomb, and that was exciting, and they were all found on the road to Bethany on the Mount of Olives. And this is not all. There is something extraordinary that happened, because Simon Peter's tomb was discovered in Jerusalem in 1953. While visiting a friend in Switzerland, I heard of what seemed to me to be one of the greatest discoveries since the time of Messiah, that Peter was buried in Jerusalem and not in Rome. The source of this rumor, written in Italian, was not clear. It left considerable room for doubt, or rather wonder. Rome was the place where I could investigate the matter, and such proved encouraging. A trip to Jerusalem might be necessary in order to gather valuable first-hand investigating various sources of information. I finally was greatly rewarded by learning where I could buy the only known book on the subject, which was also written in Italian. And it is called Gliscavi del Dominus Flevit, printed in 1958 at the Tipografia del Pipi Francescani in Jerusalem. And it was written by P.B. Bagatti and J.T. Millick, both Roman Catholic priests. The story of the discovery was there, but it seemed to be purposely hidden, for much was lacking. I consequently determined to go to Jerusalem to see for myself, if possible, that which appeared to be almost unbelievable, especially since it came from priests who naturally, because of the existing tradition that Simon Peter was buried in Rome, would be the last ones to welcome such a discovery or to bring it to the attention of the world. In Jerusalem, I spoke to many Franciscan priests who all read, finally, though reluctantly, that the bones of Simon Bar-Jonah, Simon Peter, were found in Jerusalem on the Franciscan monastery site called Dominus Flevit, where Jesus was supposed to have wept over Jerusalem on the Mount of Olives. The pictures show the story. The first shows an excavation where the names of the Christian biblical characters were found on the ossuaries or bone boxes. The names of Mary and Martha were found on one box, and right next to it was one with the name of Lazarus, their brother. Other names of early Christians were found on other boxes. Of greatest interest, however, was that which was found within 12 feet from the place where the remains of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were found, the remains of Simon Peter. They were found in an ossuary on the outside of which was clearly and beautifully written in Aramaic, Simon Bar-Jonah. Now show this charcoal inscription reads, Shimon Bar-Jonah, which means Simon Peter, son of Jonah. Matthew 16:17, and Jesus answered and said unto him, Blessed art thou, O Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto thee, but my Father which is in heaven. Speaking of acknowledging him as the Messiah. First picture is the charcoal inscription, and it says, and you read from right to left, so the Hebrew is right to left, and the last word is Simon, the middle word is Bar, and the first word is Jonah. I talked to a Yale professor who is an archaeologist and was director of the American School of Oriental Research in Jerusalem. He told me that it would be very improbable that a name with 3 words and one so complete could refer to any other than St. Peter. But what makes the possibility of error more remote is that the remains were found in a Christian burial ground, and more yet, of the 1st century, the very time in which Simon Peter lived. In fact, I have a letter from a noted scientist stating that he can tell by the writing that it was written just before the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus in 70 A.D. I talked to priest Milik, the co-writer of the Italian book, in the presence of my friend, a Christian Arab, Mr. S.J. Matar, who now is the warden of the garden tomb, not anymore, but anyway, where Jesus was buried and rose again. This priest Milik admitted that he knew that the bones of Simon Peter are not in Rome. I was very much surprised that he would admit that. So to confirm his admittance, I said, to which he also agreed, there is 100 times more evidence that Simon Peter was buried in Jerusalem than in Rome. This was something of an understatement, for he knew, as I know, that there's absolutely no evidence at all that Simon Peter was buried in Rome. Mr. S.J. Matar, the author, and priest J.T. Milik, the priest confirming the inscription of Simon Bar Jonah. I have spoken on the subject to many Franciscan priests who either were or had been in Jerusalem, and they all agree that the tomb and remains of St. Peter are in Jerusalem. There was just one exception, which is interesting, and which only proves the point. The Franciscan priest, Augusto Speicherman, who was in charge of the semi-private museum inside the walls of Old Jerusalem by the site of the Franciscan Church of the Flagellation, was that exception. When I asked to see the museum, he showed it to the 3 of us. Mr. Matar, who, in addition to being warden of the tomb of Christ at that time, had been the manager of an English bank in Jerusalem, a professional photographer, and myself. But he told us nothing of the discovery. I knew that the evidence of Simon Peter's burial was there, for priests had told me that relics from the Christian burial ground were preserved within this museum. People who lived in Jerusalem all their lives, and official guides who are supposed to know every inch of the city, however, knew nothing of this discovery. So well was it withheld from the public. I had asked an elderly official guide where the tomb of Simon Peter was, and he responded in a very profound and majestic tone of voice. The tomb of St. Peter has never been found in Jerusalem. Oh, I said, but I have seen the burial place of Simon Peter with my own eyes. He turned on me with a fierceness that is so common among these Arabs. What he replied, "You, a foreigner, mean to tell me that you know where the tomb of St. Peter is, when I have been an official guide for 35 years and know every inch of ground in Jerusalem?" He kind of sounds like one of the Pharisees. I was afraid that he would jump at my throat. I managed to calm him as I said, "But sir, here are the pictures, and you can see the ossuary among others with Peter's name in Aramaic. You can also see this for yourself on the Mount of Olives, on the Franciscan convent site called Dominus Flevit." When I finished, he slowly turned away in stunned amazement. A person who has seen this Christian burial ground and knows the circumstances surrounding the case could never doubt that this truly is the burial place of Simon Peter and of other Christians. I, too, walked around in a dreamy amazement for about a week, for I could hardly believe what I had seen and heard. Since the circulation of this article, they do not allow anyone to see this burial place. That is just unbelievable. Before things had gone very far, I had been quite discouraged, for I could get no information from the many priests with whom I had talked. However, I continued questioning priests wherever I would find them. Finally, one priest dropped some information. With that knowledge, I approached another priest who warily asked me where I had acquired that information. I told him that a priest had told me. And then he admitted the point and dropped a little more information. It went on like that for some time until I got the whole picture, and I was finally directed to where I could see the evidence for myself. To get the story, it made me feel as though I had a bull by the tail and was trying to pull him through a keyhole. But when I had gathered all the facts in the case, the priest could not deny the discovery of the tomb, but even confirmed it, though reluctantly. In fact, I have the statement from a Spanish priest on the Mount of Olives on a tape recorder to that effect. Now there's a photograph here, and it says, on the middle stone found in this excavation, one sees a mark, which is the first of two letters of the Greek word which means Christ, Messiah. But here we were talking to this Franciscan priest in charge of the museum, asking him questions, which he tried to evade, but could not because of the information I had already gathered from the many priests with whom I had spoken. And finally, after the pictures of the evidence were taken, which was nothing short of a miracle that he allowed us to do so, I complimented him on the marvelous discovery of the tomb of St. Peter in Jerusalem that the Franciscans had made. And he was clearly nervous as he said, "Oh no, the tomb of St. Peter is in Rome." But as he said that, his voice faltered, a fact which even my friend, Mr. Matar, had noticed. And then I looked him squarely in the eyes and firmly said, "No, the tomb of Simon Peter is in Jerusalem." And he looked at me like a guilty schoolboy and held his peace. He was no doubt placed there to hide the facts, but his actions and words spoke more convincingly about the discovery than those priests who finally admitted the truth. I also spoke to a Franciscan priest in authority at the priest printing plant within the walls of Old Jerusalem, where their book on the subject was printed. He also admitted that the tomb of Simon Peter is in Jerusalem. Then, when I visited the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, I encountered a Franciscan monk. After telling him what I thought of the wonderful discovery the Franciscans had made, I asked him plainly, "Do you folks really believe that those are the remains of St. Peter?" And he responded, "Yes, we do. We have no choice in the matter. The clear evidence is there." I did not doubt the evidence, but what surprised me was that priests and monks had believed that which was against their own religion, and on top of that, to admit it to others was something out of this world. Usually a Catholic, either because he's brainwashed or stubbornly doesn't want to see anything other than that which he has been taught, will not allow himself to believe anything against his religion, much less to admit it to others. But there is a growing healthy attitude among many Catholics to prove all things, hold fast to that which is good, as the Master admonished us all. And then I asked, does Father Bagatti, co-writer of the book in Italian on the subject and archaeologist, really believe that those are the bones of St. Peter? Yes, he does, was the reply. And then I asked, but what does the Pope think of all this? That was a $1,000 question, and he gave me $1 million answer. Well, he confidently answered in a hushed voice, Father Bagatti told me personally that 3 years ago he went to the Pope in Rome and showed him the evidence, and the Pope said to him, and this is not the current Pope, well, we will have to make some changes, but for the time being, keep this thing quiet. In awe, I asked also in a subdued voice, so the Pope really believes that those are the bones of St. Peter? Yes, was his answer. The documentary evidence is there. He could not help but believe. I visited various renowned archaeologists on the subject. Dr. Albright of the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore told me that he personally knew priest Bugatti and that he was a very competent archaeologist. And I also spoke to Dr. Nelson Gluck, archaeologist and president of the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio. I showed him the pictures found in this article, but being with him for only a few minutes, I therefore could not show him the wealth of material that you have before you in this article. However, he quickly recognized the Aramaic words to be Simon Bar Jonah. Aramaic is very similar to Hebrew. I asked him if he would write a statement to that effect, and he said to do so would cast a reflection on the competency of the priest, J.T. Millick, who he knew to be a very able scientist, but he said that he would write a note. I quote, "I regard Father J.T. Millick as a first-class scholar in the Semitic field," he added. "I do not consider that names on ossuaries are conclusive evidence that they are those of the apostles." Nelson Gluck. How can you deny so many people, Mary, Martha, Lazarus, Simeon the priest, and others, Salome, how can you deny that they're all in this, their ossuaries have been taken to the Dominus Flevit, and that's where they're housed, but nobody can see them. How can you deny it when their names have Jesus' cross etched on them? I quote this letter of Dr. Gluck because it shows that Priest Millick is a competent archaeologist. As I've mentioned, I was only able to be with him for a few minutes and was not able to show him but a very small part of the evidence. Anyone, including myself, would readily agree with Dr. Gluck that if only the name Simon Bar Jonah on the ossuary was all the evidence that was available, it would not be concisive evidence that it was of the Apostle Peter, though it would certainly be a strong indication. Oh, give me a break. Believe by faith, people. The story of the cave and the ossuaries and the regular cemetery just outside of the convent site is this. It was a Roman custom that when a person had died, and after about 10 years when the body had decomposed, the grave would be opened. The bones would be placed in a small ossuary with the name of the person carefully written on the outside front. These ossuaries would then be placed in a cave, as in the case of this Christian burial ground, and thus making room for others. But this cave or burial place where the ossuaries were found, and which was created and brought about through the natural and disinterested sequence of events without any reason to change facts or circumstances, was a greater testimony than if there was a witness recorded stating that Simon Peter was buried there. And yet even that is unmistakably recorded in the 3 words in Aramaic of the ossuary, Simon Bar Jonah. Herein lies the greatest proof that Simon Peter never was a pope and never was in Rome. For if he had been, it would have certainly been proclaimed in the New Testament. History likewise would not have been silent on the subject, as it was not silent in the case of the Apostle Paul. Even the Catholic history would have claimed the above as a fact and not as fickle tradition. To omit Peter as being pope and in Rome and the papacy would be like omitting the law of Moses or the prophets or the Acts of the Apostles from the Bible. Dr. Gluck, being Jewish and having been to Jerusalem, no doubt, is fully aware of the fact that for centuries the Catholic Church bought up what were thought to be holy sites, some of which did not stand up to biblical description. For instance, the priests say that the tomb of Jesus is within the walls of Old Jerusalem in a hole in the ground, whereas the Bible says that the tomb where Jesus was laid was hewn out of rock, and a stone was rolled in front and not on top of it. The garden tomb at the foot of Golgotha outside the walls of Old Jerusalem meets the biblical description perfectly. And you guys, if you have not read the excerpts about where my book started with revealing things at the Garden Tomb, you're really missing out on incredible facts and discoveries. All those who were hated by the Jewish leaders, as Jesus was, could never have been allowed to be buried within the gates of the holy city. The tomb where Jesus lay was made for Joseph of Arimathea, and his family were all stout and short of stature. In this burial place, you can see to this day where someone had carved deeper into the wall to make room for Jesus, who was said to be about 6 feet tall. When Pope Pius VII declared the Assumption of Mary to be an article of faith in 1950, the Catholic Church in Jerusalem then quickly sold the tomb of Mary to the Armenian Church. Ex-priest Lavallo told me personally that there is another tomb of St. Mary in Ephesus, but the tomb of St. Peter is altogether different, for they would rather that it never existed, and to buy or sell such a site would be out of the question. It fell upon them in this manner, as I was told by a Franciscan monk of the monastery of Dominus Flevit. One of their members was spading the ground on this site in 1953, when his shovel fell through. Excavation was started, and there a large underground Christian burial ground was uncovered. The initial of Christ in Greek was written there, which never would have been found in a Jewish, Arab, or pagan cemetery. By the structure of the writings, it was established by scientists that they were of the days just before the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus in 70 A.D. On the ossuaries were found many names of the Christians of the early church. It was prophesied in the Bible that Jesus would stand on the Mount of Olives at his return to earth. You can see then how the Christians would be inclined to have their burial ground on the mount, for here also had been a favorite meeting place of Jesus and his disciples. In all the cemetery, nothing was found, as also in the catacombs in Rome, which resembles Arab, Jewish, Catholic, or pagan practices. Dr. Gluck, being Jewish, is not fully aware, no doubt, that such a discovery is very embarrassing, since it undermines the very foundation of the Roman Catholic Church, since Simon Peter did not live in Rome, and therefore was not martyred or buried there. It naturally follows that he was not their first pope. The Catholic Church says that Peter was pope in Rome from 41 to 66 A.D., a period of 25 years, but the Bible shows a different story. There's no way that's even possible, because why would you crucify him? If he was pope, you wouldn't crucify him. The book of Acts of the Apostles, in either the Catholic or Protestant Bible, records the following. Simon Peter was preaching the gospel to the circumcision, the Jews, in Caesarea and Joppa in Palestine, ministering to the household of Cornelius, which is a distance of 1,800 miles from Rome, in Acts 10:23-24. And soon after, about the year 44 A.D., Acts 12, Simon Peter was cast into prison in Jerusalem by Herod, but he was released by an angel. From 46 to 52 A.D., we read in the 13th chapter that he was in Jerusalem preaching the difference between law and grace. Saul was converted in 34 A.D. and became Paul the Apostle in Acts 9. And my understanding that that's actually his surname. But anyway, Paul tells us that the 3 years after his conversion in 37 A.D., he went up to Jerusalem to see Simon Peter in Galatians 1:18, and in 51 A.D., 14 years later, he again went up to Jerusalem in Galatians 2:1 and 8. Simon Peter being mentioned. Soon after that, he met Simon Peter in Antioch, and as Paul says, withstood him to the face because he was to be blamed, Galatians 2:11. The evidence is abundant. The truth is clear from the scriptures, which have never failed. It would be breathtaking to read of the boldness of Paul in dealing with Simon Peter. Very few, if any, have withstood a pope and lived. except in these days when everybody seems to withstand him. If Simon Peter was Pope, it would have been no different. Paul does not only withstand Peter, but rebukes him and blames him for being at fault. All this explains why the Catholic Church has been so careful to keep this discovery unknown. They were successful in doing just that from 1953, when it was discovered by the Franciscans on their own convent site, until 1959. Having succeeded for so long in keeping this thing quiet, as the Pope had admonished, they were all off guard when a fellow at the time came along who appeared harmless but persistent. Little did they know that this fellow would publish the news everywhere. Their position in the world is shaky enough without the discovery becoming generally known. As I have mentioned, I had a very agreeable talk with Priest Melek, but I did not have the opportunity to see Priest Bagatti while in Jerusalem. I wrote to him, however, on March 15th, 1960 as follows. I have spoken with a number of Franciscan priests and monks, and they have told me about you and the book of which you are co-writer. I had hoped to see you and to compliment you on such great discovery, but time would not permit. Having heard so much about you, and that you are an archaeologist with the evidence in hand, I was convinced with you concerning the ancient burial ground that the remains found in the ossuary with the name on it, Simon Bar-Jonah, written in Aramaic, were those of St. Peter. It is remarkable that in his reply he did not contradict my statement, which he certainly could have done if he honestly could have done so, and I was very much convinced with you that the remains found in the ossuary were those of Simon Peter, and this confirms the talk I had with the Franciscan monk in Bethlehem, and the story he told me of Priest Bagatti's going to the Pope with the evidence concerning the bones of St. Peter in Jerusalem. In his letter, one can see that he is careful because of the Pope's admonition to keep this discovery quiet. He therefore wrote me that he leaves the whole explanation of the Aramaic word Simon Bar-Jonah to Priest Melek. This is a familiar way of getting out of a singular situation. In Priest Bagatti's letter, one can see that he is in a difficult position. He cannot go against what he had written in 1953, at the time of the discovery of this Christian Jewish burial ground, nor what he had said to the Franciscan monk about his visit to the Pope. However, he does raise a question which helps him get out of the situation without altogether contradicting himself and at the same time putting a smokescreen around the truth. He wrote, "Supposing that it is Jonah on the ossuary, as I believe it may be, some other relative of St. Peter, because names were passed on from family to family. To be able to propose the identification of it with St. Peter would go against a long tradition which has its own value. Anyway, another volume will come soon that will demonstrate that the cemetery was Christian and of 1st century to the 2nd century A.D. The salute in God, most devoted, P.B. Bagatti, CFM." As I have shown, after the admonition of the Pope to keep this thing quiet, Priest Bagatti leaves the interpretation of the whole matter to Priest Melek, who offers several suggestions. Titus destroyed Jerusalem in 70 A.D. and left it desolate. Therefore, it is impossible that the inscription could refer to a relative after Peter's time. One encyclopedia explains the destruction in these words: "With this event, the history of ancient Jerusalem came to a close, for it was left desolate, and its inhabitants were scattered abroad. From all evidence, Simon Peter was about 50 years old when Jesus called him to be an apostle, and he died around the age of 82, or about the year 62 A.D. Since by these figures there were only 8 years left from the time of Peter's death until the destruction of Jerusalem, this ancient Christian burial ground shows that Simon Peter died and was buried in Jerusalem, which is easily understandable since neither history nor the Bible tells of Simon Peter's having been in Rome. To make matters more clear, the Bible tells us that Simon Peter was the apostle to the Jews. Eusebius, one of the most learned men of his time, wrote the church history up to the year 325 AD, and he said that Simon Peter never was in Rome. This church history was translated by Jerome from original Greek. But in his translation, he added a fantastic story of Simon Peter's residence in Rome. And this was a common practice in trying to create credence in their doctrines, using false statements, false letters, and falsified history. This is another reason why we cannot rely on tradition, but only on the infallible Word of God. The secrecy surrounding this case is amazing and yet understandable, since Catholics largely base their faith on the assumption that Peter was their first pope and that he was martyred and buried there. But I'm somewhat of the opinion that the Franciscan priests, those who are honest, would be glad to see the truth proclaimed, even if it displeased those who are over them. While visiting with Priest Milik, I told him of the highly educated priest with whom I had spoken before going from Rome to Jerusalem, and he admitted to me that the remains of Simon Peter are not in the tomb of St. Peter in the Vatican. I asked him what happened to them, and he responded, "We don't know, but we think that the Saracens stole them away. But they never got to Rome, so there it ends." We had a good laugh together, but more so when I told him of my discussion with a brilliant American priest in Rome. I asked this American priest if he knew that the bones of Simon Peter were not in the tomb of St. Peter in the Vatican, and he admitted that they were not there. However, he said that a good friend of his, an archaeologist, had been excavating under St. Peter's Basilica for the bones of St. Peter for a number of years, and 5 years ago he found them. Now, a man can be identified by his fingerprints, but never by his bones. So I asked him how he knew that they were the bones of St. Peter, and he hesitated and tried to change the subject. But on my insistence, he finally explained that they had taken the bones to a chemist, and they were analyzed, and it was judged that the bones were of a man who had died at about the age of 65. Therefore, they must be Peter's. How ridiculous can people be? Mark you, all the priests agree that the Vatican and St. Peter's were built over a pagan cemetery, and this was a very appropriate place for them to build, since, as even Cardinal Newman admitted, there are many pagan practices in the Roman Catholic Church. You realize surely that the Christians would never bury their dead in a pagan cemetery, and you may be very sure that pagans would never allow a Christian to be buried in their cemetery. So even if Simon Peter died in Rome, which is out of the question, surely the pagan cemetery under St. Peter's Basilica would be the last place in which he would have been buried. Also, Simon Peter, from every indication, lived to be over 80 and not 65 years old. The Pope was right. Going back to the early Christian burial ground, they must make changes, and many of them, and fundamental ones at that. But I'm afraid that the Pope's admittance of the discovery on Bagotti's presentation of the documentary evidence was to satisfy Bagotti, but at the same time admonishing him to keep the information quiet, hoping that the truth of the discovery would die out. But they have said that after all these years of excavation under the Vatican, they have discovered Greek words which read, "Peter is buried here," and it gives the date 60 AD. First of all, the very structure of the sentence immediately gives one the impression that either quite recently or long ago someone put the sign there, hoping that it would be taken as authentic in order to establish that, which then, and even now, has never been proven. Then there is a discrepancy in the date, for Simon Peter was martyred around the year 62 AD and not 160 AD. And thirdly, why is it that they mention nothing about finding bones under or around the sign? While visiting the catacombs, one sees a few things which are not becoming to Christians, but which tend to indicate that the Christians had some pagan practices, similar to those of Rome today. Nothing is said about them, and only after persistent questioning will the Roman Catholic priest who acts as a guide tell you that those things, images, etc., were placed there centuries after the early Christian era. In 1950, just a few years prior to the discovery of the Christian burial ground in Jerusalem, the Pope made the strange declaration that the bones of St. Peter were found under St. Peter's in Rome. Strange as it was, for since beginning to build the church in 1450, finished in 1626, they erected St. Peter's tomb under a large dome and Bernini's serpentine columns. Since then, multiplied millions were thereby deceived into believing that the remains of St. Peter were there, which the hierarchy had all along known was not true, as is proven by the late Pope's declaration. The following was published in the Newsweek of July 1st of 1957. It was in 1950 that Pope Pius VII in his Christmas message announced that the tomb of St. Peter had indeed been found. As tradition held, beneath the immense dome of the cathedral, there was, however, no evidence that the bones uncovered there belonged to the body of the martyr. To make an announcement of such importance, when there's absolutely no evidence, is rather ridiculous, as is also brought out in the Time magazine of October 28, 1957. As in above, we quoted the article word for word. A thorough account in English of the discoveries beneath St. Peter's is now available by British archaeologists Jocelyn Toynbee and John Ward Perkins. The authors were not members of the excavating team, but scholars Toynbee, a Roman Catholic, and Perkins, an Anglican, pored over the official Vatican reports, painstakingly examined the diggings. Their careful, independent conclusions fall short of the Pope's flat statement. The Pope's statement that the remains of St. Peter were found under St. Peter's in Rome. The excavation under St. Peter's looking for the remains of St. Peter is still going on secretly in spite of the Pope's declaration of 1950. Then, in 1965, an archaeologist at Rome University, Professor Margherita Guarducci, tells of a new set of bones belonging to Simon Peter. The story was fantastic, but lacked common sense and even bordered on the infantile. But a drowning man will grab for a straw, and straw it was, so many, but the Palo Alto Times, California, May 9th, 1967, came out with an article on this subject. And I quote, other experts among them, Joseph Ruchart, Vice President of the Vatican Library, are not convinced by Miss Guarducci's evidence. There are too many unknowns, and he told reporters on a recent tour of the Vatican grottos that there's no continuous tracing of the bones. We lack historical proof. The Vatican would seem to be on the Monsignor side because so far it has taken no steps to officially recognize the bones as St. Peter's. So, long story short, they venerated some of these bones, and they have no proof that they are the right bones. But the most astounding statement in the long article found in the above-mentioned newspapers is the professor did not submit them, Peter's bones, to modern scientific tests, which would have determined the approximate age because she feared the process would have reduced them to dust. How could any scientific study of bones be carried out without first scientifically determining the age of the person or bones? And this would be of the greatest interest and the most important for further research. Also, any scientist or chemist knows that you do not have to submit the whole skeleton for testing to determine the age. A part of the shin bone or of a rib would be sufficient. It appears that she was protecting her Peter's bones from another possible disaster, which a wrong age would have caused. The Vatican and others have calculated through all existing evidence that Simon Peter lived to be around 82 years, and that he died around the year 62 or 64 AD. And these figures go along perfectly, as does everything else in the case with the remains found in the Jewish Christian burial ground on the Mount of Olives, and in the ossuary, on which was clearly and beautifully written, Simon Bar Jonah in Aramaic. The following was taken from the book Races of Mankind, page 161. Strained attempts to have Simon Peter the Apostle to the Hebrews of the East in Paul's territory at Rome and martyred there are unworthy of serious consideration in the light of all the contemporary evidence. At his age, 82, That would not have been practicable. In none of Paul's writings is there the slightest intimation that Simon Peter had ever been, nor was, in the city of Rome. All statements to the contrary were made centuries later and are fanciful and hearsay. The papacy was not organized until the second half of the 8th century. It broke away from the Eastern Church. That the idea of Simon Peter being in Rome is irreconcilable with the silence of the Scriptures and even with the mere fact of Paul's epistle to the Romans. In the year 58, Paul wrote his epistle to the Roman Church, but does not mention Simon Peter, although he does name 28 leaders in the church at Rome in Romans 16:7. The conclusion must inevitably be reached that Simon Peter was never in Rome. Paul lived and wrote in Rome, but he declared that only Luke is with me in 1 Timothy 4:11. Written in 1960 by F. Paul Peterson, and 1960 he gives an address from his author and publisher, F. Paul Peterson, P.O. Box 7351, Fort Wayne, Indiana, and the price at that time was $2. Permission is granted to reproduce any part of this book if title, price, and address where it may be purchased or given, which I've just done. And that was printed in 1960, so more than likely it's out of print. And I know this is a long story, but it's very important to understand the history of this, and I can't do it in a short TikTok video. So you'll have to bear with me, come back and listen to different parts of it if you can't stand to sit there for long. I want to reiterate this part of the story, because he said, "In Jerusalem I spoke to many Franciscan priests who all read finally, though reluctantly, that the bones of Simon Bar-Jonah, St. Peter, were found in Jerusalem on the Franciscan monastery site called Dominus Flevit, where Jesus was supposed to have wept over Jerusalem on the Mount of Olives." And this is on the road to Bethany. The pictures show the story, and the first shows an excavation where the names of Christian biblical characters were found. And that's the story I told yesterday and saved this one for today. And on the ossuaries, the bone boxes, the names of Mary, Martha were found on one box, and right next to it was the one with the name Lazarus, their brother. And this is where they found Simeon the priest, the one who circumcised the Messiah and was overjoyed when he was there at the temple and said, "Now my eyes have seen," basically the Messiah that was promised to us. And I'm just paraphrasing, but it's exciting. And other names of early Christians were found on other boxes. But listen, I'm going to leave you with this. Of the greatest interest, however, was that which was found within 12 feet from the place where the remains of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were found, the remains of Simon Peter. And they were found in an ossuary, on the outside of which was clearly and beautifully written in Aramaic, Simon Bar-Jonah, which is Shimon Bar-Yonah. You know, I had often wondered why Jesus chose those Jewish disciples, Simon and Andrew, and I just love Simon Peter. They got to be friends. I wrote about them in my book, and I get choked up because the Lord revealed so much from the Jewish perspective about it, and it's just absolutely thrilling. In my book, The Almond Tree, Aaron's Rod, the Messiah, King of Israel, which is at olivepresspublisher.com, and truly the Lord was revealing things for this time period in which we're living. Do you remember when Jesus told Simon Peter that he was going to make them fishers of men? Well, one day it just occurred to me, what if he chose the sons of Zebedee? What if he chose them because he was the son of Jonah? What if his ancestor was Jonah, who was swallowed by the big fish. And here he was going to catch men and being sent forth by Jesus the Messiah, the King of Israel. And he was sent to his fellow Jews to reveal the King to them. What if he's a descendant of Jonah? And he's going to fish men. It's truly astonishing, and I'll leave you with that thrilling, somebody said gospel bumps. I thought that was funny. I hope and pray that this message gets out and that you're blessed by it. And I will see you in the next episode. Shalom for now. I hope you do have the goosebumps.